Raul Castro has said he's stepping down in 2018, and I think he will. He's designated his successor. He has been saying to the Cuban people for his 6 years now in office that we cannot blame all of our problems on the United States any longer. We have to look inward and face who we are and what our challenges are.
Welcome back to The Arena. I'm Michael Corrin. Now, Cuba and the United States of America. What is the history of all this and why the new relationship? Why at this point, if anything indeed does move forward? If anyone can decipher and dissect, it's historian and commentator John Robson. He joins us now from Ottawa. What is the history that is pertinent to this? Obviously, there's a long history between the two countries, but some of it surely is now in the clouds of memory.
Well, it seems to me that it is, although in some sense not in the mind of Barack Obama, who, as he so often does, appears to look at this from a kind of anti-colonial lens. When he talked about restoring relations, he mostly dwelled upon what America had done wrong. He skirted around the fact that Cuba has a repressive and highly ineffective government. But to me, the core of the matter is that after Fidel Castro seized power and made radical changes to Cuba's economy and became a repressive tyrant, he also became a key Soviet ally, a bridgehead for international communism in the Americas. And the embargo and the break in diplomatic relations were related to the fact that Cuba was a tentacle of a serious geopolitical threat. That ceased back in 1989. And of course, America was kind of trapped because to establish relations seemed to imply that you then approved of Fidel Castro, but it doesn't work that way. And I did agree with the president when he pointed out that the United States has had diplomatic relations with China for over 3 decades. For that matter, throughout the Cold War, the United States had diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union, which was the sponsor of Cuba. And so I do think that this was an outdated piece of frozen in time. Cuba was still a repressive regime, but the United States does not break relations with repressive regimes. If it did, it wouldn't have relations with half the countries in the world, including Saudi Arabia and China. There are only 5 nations with which the United States does not have diplomatic relations. One is Bhutan, which won't maintain diplomatic relations with any permanent member of the UN Security Council. That's not America's doing. One is its ally Taiwan because of the China situation. And that only leaves 3 bad guys. And they're North Korea, Syria, and Iran, 2 of whom pose a clear and present danger to the West, and one of which is engaged in massacring its own civilians on an enormous scale. So Cuba really was an outlier, and though I don't like the way Barack Obama did it, for once I think what he did made sense.
Well, I'm glad you said that, because I do tend to agree. It seemed to me, as someone who came from Europe to Canada, both European countries and Canada have a very different relationship with Cuba, it was almost embarrassing. It was such a digression. When there were missiles, when Soviet missiles were either threatened or actually on Cuban soil, absolutely understandable. But the Americans do not have a stellar record of their time in Cuba. Organized crime was extremely significant in the country. I believe they could have broken down these barriers in the past. And look, there is trade now. There is investment. And this is a point I've made earlier. Venezuela is, I believe, a tangible threat to the region. And Venezuela is having a good time in Cuba right now. It's investing. It has an alliance with Iran. By doing this, if anyone is concerned about America's relationship, it's actually Venezuela.
Yeah, and they're pretty angry about what happened, although I was reading one news story that suggested they're also relieved because they've been providing Cuba with an oil subsidy, and Venezuela's economy is such a mess at this point, they can hardly continue that. But since Venezuela is thought to have some ties not only with Cuba and that kind of radicalism, but with jihadis, that there are training camps and so on, if you were going to break relations with a government over its threat in Latin America, it would be Venezuela now. But again, my view of diplomatic relations is it's not a seal of approval, it's an admission of fact. Such and such a regime does control this country. And when you make it a stamp of approval, one of the most embarrassing things that ever happened to Jimmy Carter, and he certainly had a lot of those, was after the Vietnamese invaded Cambodia and ousted the genocidal Khmer Rouge, Carter was left fighting for the Khmer Rouge seat in the UN on the grounds that their deposition had been contrary to international law. Whereas, in point of fact, he should simply say, look, we will recognize that somebody is in charge of a country if that person is in charge of the country. It doesn't mean we like them. It doesn't mean we send them Christmas cards. They're not coming over for dinner. We're just admitting they're the government whether we want them to be or not. And again, I think Barack Obama could have been a little clearer on the seedy and repressive nature of the Cuban regime. But it is the government. He started out his speech by saying tonight the United States is changing its relationship with the Cuban people. And it was actually about a change in government. He mentioned the Bay of Pigs, but not the Cuban Missile Crisis. So it was a very odd way of doing it. But the fact of the matter is, yeah, the Castros are still in charge. They've been in charge forever. It's like the Autumn of the Patriarch. and therefore admit they're in charge. Doesn't mean you're going to go and smiling buddy, would you like to, share a meal. It's just, yeah, that's the fact of the matter. Again, we don't like the Chinese Politburo, but they are there regardless.
Mm-hmm. People are generalizing, rather. They want one solution to every issue. Sanctions sometimes work, sometimes they don't work. It depends on the size of the country, the regime we're actually facing, who they're allied with. So we can't apply one solution to all of the many geopolitical challenges we face. And so, yes, there's an alliance with Saudi Arabia. Yes, shaking hands with the blasphemy law, Pakistan. Yes, sanctions were applied to South Africa. It depends on the country and the era. And at this time with Cuba, yeah, I don't say it with relish, but I think President Barack Obama has probably done the right thing.
Yeah, and there's one thing that really galls me. I rule about politics. If the other guys did it, what would you think? When you come to debate sanctions and diplomatic isolation, there's this long-standing pattern that the left wants to isolate right-wing regimes and engage with left-wing regimes, and the right wants to engage with right-wing regimes and isolate left-wing regimes. And that is nonsensical. Remember, in the old days, the left really wanted to boycott South Africa, but they didn't want to boycott Nicaragua, and the right felt the opposite. At least we could be consistent to say a criterion like clear and present danger, sanctions designed to cripple a geopolitical offensive, yes. Otherwise, admit they're in charge whether you like them or not. On the whole, engagement probably is a better policy. It's not a great policy. It's only a better policy. Show them how the world really works. But we need to apply that without regard to, hey, they're the red team or, hey, they're the blue team, because that short-circuits your brain.
Yes, I think so. And I've not been to Cuba. People I know who holiday there quite often, their reaction, Canadians, has been, oh, no, now there'll be lots of Americans there. So I suppose that's not such a...
That's high-minded. I mean, I've never taken a vacation to Cuba. I don't think it's a good idea to have cheap fun in the sun at the expense of slave labor. I think that's disgusting. But... now to complain, oh, what about my vacation? What about the Cuban people? Could we spare a thought for them laboring under this? And again, the Castro regime is not like Pol Pot. They're not genocidal. They're not in the upper ranks of insane. They're just grimly repressive in the unpleasant Latin American Codillo style, one of the great ironies. They're meant to be the communist wave of the future, and they're actually this martinet man on horseback wave of the past. But it's a grubby regime, and you shouldn't be personally scooping up the honey thanks to their bad policies.
I'm ambivalent about that because, to quote the great philosopher Johnny Rotten, holidays in other people's misery, we could also apply perhaps Mexico, some of the West Indian islands to this as well. They may not be communistic and despotic, but they're also effectively enslaving people. People are working for very little. Anyway, that's another discussion. Hey, always a pleasure, my friend. Thank you so very much indeed.